Thank you.
Now we'll see if that's working.
Good morning.
All right, now we're on. Okay. So, welcome to those who are online. I did not realize that we weren't streaming yet, so we've already had our prayer, but we'll get started. All right, so today's lesson is about the power of personal testimony. And let's start with the example of somebody who gave his testimony successfully, and that's in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. And we'll start with verses 1 through 5. Who will read that for us?
I will. They arrived on the other side of the lake in the region of is it Gerasenes or Gerasenes? Anyway, Gennesaret is what I think the KJV calls it. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the graveyard to meet him. This man lived among the tombs, and it had been impossible to tie him up anymore, even with a chain. He had often been tied up with chains and shackles, but he simply tore the chains apart and broke the shackles into pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Day and night he was always shouting out among the tombs and in the hills nearby, cutting himself with sharp stones.
All right. So this paints a pretty severe picture of this man. Let's kind of get some idea of who we're talking about, and there is actually. Do we have room for everybody here? One thing that I notice here is that he's cutting himself, and I used to wonder why somebody would cut themselves when they are not doing well, and then I learned that there's actually a modern phenomenon of that as well. It's a unhealthy way of dealing with emotional pain. So people who have extreme emotional pain will cut themselves because physical pain is more tolerable than emotional pain. And that can be an addiction, just like anorexia, bulimia can be an addiction for people to deal with their emotional pain. And I would imagine that if you're possessed with the devil, there'd be a lot of emotional pain involved. So we recognize he did not like the life he was in, right? What other things do we see about this demoniac?
Well, him doing what he's doing is a cry for help.
Yes. So he wasn't in a perfect state where he's like, oh, well, I'm happy serving the devil and everything's fine. When the devil takes control, sometimes it seems great for a little while, but eventually he's going to start oppressing, isn't he?
And if he was cutting himself, he must have been miserable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people were afraid of him too, so no one was willing to even try to help him.
Okay, and why were they afraid of him?
Because of the way he looked, the way he acted. He was possessed by spirits.
And what's one other detail that it tells us about this man that made people afraid of him?
Anger.
Anger, okay. We can assume that there was anger involved. There's a very verse 4 talks about how they tried to shackle him, right? They tried to put him in chains, and he always broke them. So he had, through demonic means, superhuman strength. And so So this was a man who certainly had some extra influences in his life. Okay, let's read 6 through 13. Who will read that for us? Mark chapter 5, verses 6 through 13.
When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." How far did you say?
Through 13.
13. Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. And a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountain. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine, that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea, and drowned in the sea.
All right. So here we have his encounter, and I find it interesting, and this really doesn't specifically go with the topic of the message, but notice he's running to Jesus. So his actions imply that he wants Jesus. But what do his words say? He's afraid of Jesus, according to his words, right? So, I've seen this in several stories about demon possession in the Bible. And actually, I had a pastor friend who had a similar story when he was in the Philippines, where it seems as though the devil, when somebody is completely possessed by the devil can control your speech, but he cannot keep you from coming to Jesus. So this man runs to Jesus, he falls down at his feet like he's worshiping him, right? And he does worship him. But what he says is the devil's words. Clearly, we are many, right? He was one man. So when he says legion for we are many, that's the demons talking, right? And there was this pastor friend that I was telling you about. He was doing a revival series in the Philippines, and this demon-possessed woman had come to the meetings, and they knew she was demon-possessed. And at one point, she came forward, and she came forward to the platform in order, her physical actions showed that she was wanting to respond, but her words were very hostile. And taking a cue from stories like this, they surrounded her and they began praying. And the demon was cast out. And she was released from that. And she had wanted to be saved from the demon, but she had not been able to say that. So that could be a side thing there. What other things do we learn from this story about this man and how Jesus interacted with him? Anything else stand out to you?
Jesus knew pretty much human nature, and as you read the stories of him working with people, like after he fed the 5,000, there was no record of them being baptized. But later, after Pentecost, many were baptized. Probably some of those were in that crowd. And Jesus sent him back to his people. I mean, he had just come to Christ, but he hadn't grown in Christ yet. And by him going back and telling his own people what happened to him, that was going to help him grow, which Christ knew that ahead of time, and why he sent him back to those people. And many people will accept from mankind where they won't accept from Christ himself. And Christ knew that. I mean, Lucifer didn't accept Christ in heaven, turned against him. So, and this is another thing to consider, that when we are representing Christ to other people, if they reject us, they're not rejecting us personally, they're rejecting the message and the message of Christ. And so there's a lot of things we can gain from that story and many others like it.
And that's a good lead-in to the rest of the story. So we ended in verse 13 with the pigs being drowned into the sea, and the man was healed. Verse 14. So those who fed the swine, who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country, and they went out to see what it was that had happened. And when they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed, and he, by the legion, sitting clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid. And those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed, and about the swine. And they began to plead with him to depart from the region. We'll stop there for a second. So it's interesting that the response wasn't, wow, look at this great miracle. I mean, everybody knew how dangerous this man was. You can imagine that every parent told their kids, don't go to the caves, right? And then every kid at some point dared somebody else, go to the caves, see how close you can get, right? But of course they didn't get terribly close because they didn't want to be attacked. So they knew that this was a real concern in their lives. And now they see this man clothed and in his right mind, and their response is, get out of here. Leave us. Because financial concerns were of utmost importance. And I hear people often say, well, all that we need to do is live a life for Jesus, and then people will flock to him. You don't need to say anything, just live your life. Well, in this man's case, he was living a life for Jesus. His testimony was stronger than any of ours because the contrast was so great. And they still sent him away. They still sent Jesus away. But Jesus had a plan.
I find it interesting how much fear kind of played into all of the interactions here. You know, the fear of Jesus, fear of what Jesus would do in their lives. You know, even when the demoniac came to him, it's like, you know, don't torment me. You know, torment me not. Then when the people saw the pigs go into the water, they were afraid. You know, that fear. I think a lot of times it prevents us coming from Jesus. We're afraid of the consequences. We're afraid of what he's going to ask us to do. We're afraid of the ramifications in our life, financial. Maybe our lives look completely different. But I sometimes feel like fear is a lot of the time the driving factor. And I think that's why God tells us so much, don't be afraid. Because it's a natural human reaction to fear the unknown, to fear change, to fear all these things. And I think sometimes that gets in our way of responding to Jesus' call to do whatever it is.
That's a good point.
You know, this is more of a general comment on this story, but, you know, I've wondered in the past, probably something that we all have thought about, and that is, you know, does God love me as an individual, or does he more love the world in general? Does he really care about me as a person? And, you know, this is one of those stories that gives me that assurance, because, you know, no interaction that Jesus had with people was a coincidence. You know, the Syrophoenician woman, the woman at the well, you know, he didn't just happen to run into these people. Same with this demoniac. He didn't just happen to run into him. It was in God's plan, God's loving plan for Jesus to meet these people who needed him so much. And, you know, that's comforting to me that, you know, no one is beyond God's help, and that God does really love the individual. And like the parable of the 99 and the one lost sheep, God really is after me us as an individual, as individuals, to save us.
Yeah, and along with that example that you were giving, you mentioned the woman at the well. I think it's interesting that the Bible says that Jesus needed to go to Samaria. You look at where he was going, he didn't need to go to Samaria for that trek. There was another way that most Jews would have taken. But he needed to go there because he needed to meet that woman. Mm-hmm. So, well, let's see what God's plan was here, because Jesus didn't just, he left, because Jesus won't stay around where he's not invited. But verse 18 through 20, who will read verses 18 through 20?
And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. That's where the answer comes. All marveled at his testimony that he gave. And that's how Christ knew that he was actually going to grow himself, by giving his testimony to those other people.
Yes. So on the surface, I bet it seemed really strange, because it's not like Jesus didn't have people follow him. It'd be one thing if Jesus was kind of a loner and no one followed him, but he had people to follow him. He had his 12 disciples. There were another 70. They were in another group at some point. And then there were women as well that were a different group that followed. So there were always people following him. So it would seem maybe weird. Here's Jesus rejecting him, saying, "No, you can't follow me. Go home," you know? But he had a specific plan for this man in personal growth, like you said, Ed, and also he had a plan for the message to go to the people. And notice the difference when they just saw his actions. It wasn't enough to get them to be willing to change their views and to change their priorities. Their priorities were money and finances. Those pigs were expensive. Now, when it's his testimony, that had a powerful influence. And I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But you find he goes back to this area and the people received him. You know, later on, he goes back to this area and the people received him. They brought their sick to him and he healed them and so on. Why is that? Because of this man's testimony. So a testimony can be very powerful. Any other thoughts on that?
I think our testimony is one of the most powerful pieces of gospel that we can give. I mean, I think people like to hear the stories of the miracles. There's big events that happen, and I think the most miraculous thing is the changes that can happen in our own lives. And our testimony is kind of hard to argue with. I mean, you can argue theological facts, you can argue different things, but it's kind of hard to argue with somebody experiencing peace, or somebody experiencing joy, or somebody experiencing the good things that come from a relationship with God. And that, to somebody, is a great way to spread the gospel, is to tell our experience, our miraculous things in those small ways.
I was just reading a book last night by Dick Dirksen, who is a storyteller. That's his big thing, to tell stories. Also a classmate of my dad, so it's a little bit more in tune just because there's that connection. And he was talking about the power of story, which of course we all know. But when it comes to the way Jesus taught, he taught through story, primarily parables.
Yeah.
And our testimony is at its core a story. And Dirksen was pointing out how a story can take a dry conversation about facts, I guess like what we're having right now, and it can bring it to life in a way that pierces past our guard And it sinks in. And we can remember a story years from now, whereas we don't necessarily remember the conversation that surrounded it. So the story can be very important in that way too.
Last week, you mentioned that you went to somebody's house 3 times to get them to take Bible studies or whatever it was.
Yes.
And now you just mentioned a story, so I thought I'd interject one here.
Go for it.
Years ago, I went to a home where the lady had sent in a request on the Bible story, and it was a hot summer day, and the man was drinking a beer on his front porch. And when I told him what I was there for, he says, "We don't need anything like that in our home." And she's not here anyway, so a few days later I went back, same thing, he was on the front porch drinking a beer. He says, "I told you before, we don't need anything like that in our home." And she wasn't there again, but I went back again the 3rd time. She was home and with some others there in the house, children and some other adults. And she invited me in and he followed me in. And so I knew that if I was going to reach them, I had to share enough with them that he would be convinced that he did need them. And I can't tell you what I said, but every situation is different. But when I got through, she wanted the Bible story for the children, but I had shown her the Bible Reference Library, which is Conflict of the Ages series, and she said, "Well, I would like those too, but I just want the Bible story." And her husband, the only time he ever said anything after he said, "We don't need those," he said, "You're going to get them, you're going to get them all." Now, we don't always see a transformation in a person's life right there in front of you, but I could tell you many stories where I saw it happen with individuals like that. And like I said, I can't tell you what all I said, but I really gave the canvas to her, but I was pointing it at him. You have to say things that are going to convince the person that is objectioning up front. So sometimes you can see them change right in front of you, but it may be later. And Christ didn't try and change the people in that town. It was later after that man's testimony that those people then probably, so maybe not all, but many probably did.
So that actually brings to mind an idea about different kinds of testimony. So there's a public testimony that's just given to everyone. And I enjoy listening to those. We put them on the radio on the Highland 7 program when we can. One of my favorite ones is Ron Halverson Sr.'s testimony. And he gets up there and he tells about how he was into gangs and how he was eventually converted. And I don't think he generally tells this part in his testimony, but for his first evangelistic series, they rented a hall and the people didn't open it up. Well, he was an old gangster, so he just broke in and they had their meeting. So, you know, it's a fascinating testimony and it has some great results. But what you gave, Ed, was not a broad testimony to everybody. You gave a tailor-made testimony to an individual. And I think there's a special power in that. When we talk to somebody, we naturally build a rapport. We're going to naturally make our testimony a little bit different just to kind of fit what we know about that person, even without thinking about it. Just conversation works that way. And when you sit in an audience and hear an appeal, it's easy to think about all the other people who need to respond. But when somebody's in your living room looking at you and you give an appeal, there's only one person to respond. You either respond or you don't. And so that's kind of what your story made me think of. The power of testimony it's a very personal thing, or it can be a very personal thing. So does anybody else have a testimony or a story they'd like to share about when either somebody told them a testimony that had a powerful influence on their life, or when they had the opportunity to share a testimony with somebody?
I just know go ahead. I remember reading a week or two ago that how the angels rejoice over just one who accepts Christ. That's all.
Yep. Yeah.
Again, I don't know if you'd say this was a personal testimony. I guess I kind of took it this way, but it's always stayed with me. I guess, it was powerful enough that it stayed with me over many years. But when I was at Southern, they had a publication that came out every week, and the last page of that publication, they'd go around and just interview students, and they'd ask them a question, and usually the idea was to try to make up some kind of a funny answer so you get, your response published. But I think the question of that week was, what's the most important, decision you ever made? And there were lots of silly, responses, but one, that was printed has always stuck with me. It was a person, and he said, to give my life to Jesus, he changed my life and saved me from myself. And just that short, succinct, testimony, it just always stayed with me. And I imagine it had an impact on a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I often do talk about when I'm doing premarital counseling is I language versus you language. So I can, if you're in conflict time, if you're using you language, that's, you always do this to me, you make me feel insulted, that's you language, that's accusatory, that puts somebody on the defensive. Most people, when they get on the defensive, won't change even if they're convinced that they're wrong, because it's just uncomfortable to be on the defensive. And whereas I language, you're owning your issue. I felt this way when you did this thing. You're not saying that that person intended to do it, but you felt that way. And so a testimony can also be less likely to put somebody on the defensive if we share, like Danny, like your person did. The person who wrote, it was all about him. It wasn't you need to do this. This is what Jesus did for me. This is what he did. This is how he changed my life. Or like Jesus said, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. This man didn't necessarily, we don't know what he said, but if you follow Jesus' instructions, he didn't go around saying, Ed, you need to be converted. Larry, you need to change. He just said, Ed, let me tell you what Jesus did for me. Larry, you remember that time when I chased you? There's a difference. And here's what changed, right? Very personal. It was I language, not offensive, not affronting.
Well, I like the idea that you mentioned, how it changed, having your testimony, how it grows you, as a person, how it changes you. And Danny and I have been talking a lot about kind of like mindset, like how you go into something with a mindset. Like if you want to survive, you have to have a certain mindset, you have to have a certain positivity. And I think the more we share our testimony about what Jesus does for us, it changes our mindset and our relationship with God, because our mindset changes to one of thankfulness and gratefulness, and it turns all those switches in our brain that help us to feel a certain way. And I think it helps, like you said, grow our relationship with God. The more that we have that opportunity to do that, sometimes we get so caught up, in this everyday life and living, and our mindset just gets so caught up in those, and our relationship with God kind of suffers. But I think the more we share, it changes how we feel about, if we say something positive about other people, it makes us feel more positive toward that person. If we say something negative about that, it can change our relationship with them in a negative way.
And it really forces us to look and see how God lived is working in our lives. If we're telling people about it, we can just sort of flow through life and experience and bask in the blessings of God and not even really think about them. But when we start telling our testimony, then we suddenly start realizing, wow, look what God's done in all these different circumstances. And, I think sometimes we look at testimonies like this one in Mark, or like the one I mentioned, Ron Halverson Sr.'s, where God takes somebody from the very lowest place and he raises them up. And for somebody like me who grew up in a good Adventist home, not that I've never had questions, but I never really had a desire to leave. I think there's often a temptation, especially in those teenage years, to think, well, I don't even have a testimony. And I remember thinking, I wouldn't want to do this because I wouldn't want the baggage, but if only I had kind of gone crazy for a little while and I'd have a story to tell, it would be impressive. And so I think it's valuable to have people, even if you don't come from one of those backgrounds, somebody who is open in sharing how the Lord is working in their life can help people like me to understand that's okay, that's good. In fact, that's the ideal. The ideal is if you don't have a terrible story to tell. That's our goal, right? How many of us have said, I hope my kids go absolutely crazy, almost kill themselves, and then come to God so they can be a better witness? No, we don't do that. We do our best to give them the best shot at growing up to be faithful Christians all their life. Obviously, they have to make those choices, but we do our best to give them the best shot at that because we know instinctively that's the best thing, and yet sometimes we feel like if we have that, we don't have anything to share. And I think we do. So, yeah, Sue, you had something.
Well, when you were talking about the counseling and that, I thought of Neil Nedley's program where he says, when you would say, oh, you make me so mad, or you did this. And it's not what they did, but it's how we choose to feel about what they do. And I just thought that was, when we're talking to someone or getting upset at someone, we can't say, they make me so upset, I don't want to be around them. No, they don't make me upset. I choose to be upset.
Yeah, when I first took that Nedley training, I was going through, especially the CBD portion, and I kept thinking, wow, my parents were smart. CBT, yeah. CBD is a
Well, marijuana.
CBT, cognitive behavior.
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
No, I can't even talk. Yeah. Cognitive behavioral therapy.
So they, because those are all principles that my parents lived and taught. And then I come and find out, hey, there's actual research behind all this stuff, not just anecdotal. So, yes.
I was going to say, I felt the way you did about, I grew up as an Adventist and didn't feel like I had a story to tell either, because even though I'm not perfect by any means, I don't have that being on drugs story or anything like that. But 3 years ago, I call it my Job experience, when I was in the hospital 5 times in 6 months, and I'm a healthy person. And it just seems like one thing after another kept happening to me. And I won't go into detail about all of the 5 things, but the last one, I had a ruptured appendix and felt like I was going to die with the infection process. And both my surgeon and my family practice doctors said to me different times, you are amazing. You are the strongest person I've ever seen. You can be commended for how well you've done through all this adversity you've had over the last 6 months. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, you've got the wrong idea, because I am very weak, and my strength has not come from myself. And I wanted them to know that God is my strength. Amen. And I said, this is just a simple thing to say. God is on my side. He's been by my side the whole 6 months. And with him by my side, we've got this. We can handle anything. And that's one thing you can tell people, because there's a lot of people that feel alone in the world and feel like, I can't do this. But if you can assure them that God was with you, then they can know that he will be with them during their crises or whatever's happening in their life. It's just a simple, statement. With God by my side, We got this. We can do anything. God is my strength. And that's what I said to both of them.
And your testimony isn't always what God did in the past. It's what God is doing now.
Now.
In your case, it was what God is doing now. I remember a pastor, Larry Owens, hospitalized with a terrible, they couldn't figure out what it was. And he was transferred up to Birmingham, where I was pastor, and that's how I really got to know him, because I visit with him and stuff. And it was fascinating to see that the hospital staff would make excuses to come in there because he was ministering to them more than they were ministering to him. And just his faith and his testimony, and he was literally, he didn't die, but he was literally expected to die from this weird disease, which turned out to be a form of cancer, but it took him a long time to find that out. And so, but his testimony, he didn't tell them how God had brought him to salvation in the first place. He was constantly talking about how God was with him there and could be with them too. So, yeah, Heather.
Yeah, the kids and I were listening to the Bible on my Bible app this morning during breakfast, and we came to the part in 2 Chronicles 20. You know the story of the Israelites, and they are about to go into battle. There's this huge army about to attack them, and God told them to put the singers out there. You know, they'd sing the praises of God. They wouldn't even have to fight. But anyway, before they knew that, there's this prayer by Jehoshaphat. He says, Jehoshaphat stood before the community of Judah and Jerusalem in front of the new courtyard at the temple of the Lord. He prayed, O Lord, God of our ancestors, you alone are the God who is in heaven. You are ruler of all the kingdoms of the earth. You are powerful and mighty. No one can stand against you. O our God, did you not drive out those who lived in this land when your people Israel arrived? And did you not give this land forever to the descendants of your friend Abraham? Your people settled here and built this temple to honor your name. They said, whenever we are faced with any calamity such as war, plague, or famine, we can come to stand in your presence before this temple where your name is honored. We can cry out to you to save us, and you will hear us and rescue us. And now see what the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir are doing. You would not let our ancestors invade those nations when we left Israel and Egypt. Anyway, it goes on and on. But Kevin pointed out, how, he said, it seems like whenever there are prayers recorded in the Bible, they're always reminding God of what he's done in the past. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. Because here they are reminding God of how he's been faithful every step of the way. And they're saying, okay, God, we're in another calamity. We know you're going to be faithful again. We're grateful to see how you're going to do it, And I like that about, we're talking about testimonies. Part of that is, rehashing how God has been faithful. And you're right, it changes our mindset. So, anyway, I just thought that was...
Let's go ahead and look at another example of a testimony, and that's in Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 11. Mark 16, 9 through 11.
Now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. And she went and told them that they had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And they, when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, believed not.
All right, so when Mary saw Jesus, what did he ask him to do? Well, in this passage it doesn't say that he asked, but in other Gospels we know that he said, go tell the disciples and Peter, right? So he had there was a command to do it. And she responded. Her reaction to the good news was to tell others. And what was their reaction?
Believer.
I didn't believe her.
Yeah, disbelief. Part of it was an unbelievable story, right? I mean, somebody raises from the dead, that's kind of hard to believe. So, what can we learn about sharing our testimony from a story like this, where the testimony isn't initially believed?
It says at the end that if the disciples didn't believe who was already with Jesus, then we don't always expect others who weren't telling to believe. They're not all going to believe unless they see for themselves, I think.
So telling our story doesn't necessarily guarantee somebody's going to respond to it, but Mary Magdalene still told her story, right? And it came from her heart. She had to tell a story. Obviously, it'd be hard not to tell about something like that.
I guess it tells us, it doesn't let us off the hook. Jesus knew ahead of time that the disciples wouldn't believe her, but he still told her, go tell them, just because our what we are supposed to do isn't dependent on what somebody else is supposed to do. It's what we are asked to do. That's all that we can do. And then we don't try to control other people's belief. We still are told, hey, go tell your story, go tell them. Or, we're not just go tell the people that you think might believe you, or go tell everybody, about me. So sometimes we think, well, they won't believe me, so therefore I'm off the hook. It's like, well, no, you're still on the hook for it. You're still needing to tell others.
So a modern version of that is something I've heard in every church I've been in, with the exception of this one. I haven't heard this yet here. But people say, well, evangelism doesn't work anymore. And that's an excuse for not doing it. It costs money, it's difficult, and so on. And they say it doesn't, or more often they'll say, it doesn't work here. Yeah, it works other places, but it doesn't work in this city. And every church I've been at, they've said, this is a particularly difficult territory, and evangelism doesn't work here.
I've heard that here.
Well, I've only been here a short time. I'm sure some people say here. But, according to this, that doesn't let us off the hook. Right? We have a testimony to share. We have something to say. And whether or not people respond is not our issue. We're supposed to be faithful in telling the story. And I really liked how you said it, Kimberly, that Jesus knew that they wouldn't believe her, and yet he still told them to tell the story. So Larry, did you have something I think your hand was up a bit ago.
I was just going to dovetail on what Kimberly was saying, how 11 of the disciples saw him, talked with him, and yet Thomas didn't believe them. So, yeah, it was a pretty incredible in the sense of, I don't believe it, pretty incredible story. So it wasn't just because, okay, Mary's Mary, she's got a past, and she's a woman, and women aren't much in our society. All 11 disciples saw him, and yet Thomas. So that's pretty significant.
I also want to point out that initially they did not believe her, and yet the Gospels record in multiple places, it might be all four, I haven't checked, but it might be all four, that Mary was the first one to see Jesus alive and that she went and told the story. Now, the Gospels don't record every story that happened in Jesus' life, right? And not all the Gospels record the same ones. Somehow this must have been important enough to get on the list for, if not all, most of the Gospels to be put on there. So obviously that testimony, while it was not originally received, later became powerful. And so our testimonies may not initially get responded to the way that we want, but that doesn't mean that they completely die.
I found it interesting too, while you're saying that, even though they might have not have believed her, it still spurred on to other people to take off running. It was enough of a spark, even though they weren't convinced. It still spurred them into pursuing more, to dive deeper. And so sometimes we feel like we have to take somebody from point A all the way to point B, and I don't think that's the way it works. Sometimes there's small steps towards something else, and we don't, like you said, sometimes we don't see that entire change, but it might cause somebody to look deeper, and maybe the next person that comes say, hey, I want to check that out, or I want to look more. So sometimes we're looking for that big, huge turnabout, and then smaller steps towards something different.
Yeah, so the quotation from Christ Object Lessons that I botched last week because I couldn't find it, it fits with this conversation too. It says, this is Christ Object Lessons, page 363, first paragraph. It says, but when we give ourselves wholly to God and in our work follow His direction, He makes Himself responsible for its accomplishment. He would not have us conjecture as to the success of our honest endeavors. Not once should we even think of failure. We are to operate with one who knows no failure. And so Mary, she worked with God, right? And she gave her honest endeavors, right? And Jesus made Himself responsible for the results of that. And it didn't seem successful at first, but later on it did.
Which chapter?
And it spurred more action. This is chapter
25.
It's called Talents Returned.
Okay.
I don't see the chapter number on this.
I need to frame that somewhere.
The next verse or the next paragraph says, we should not talk about our own weakness and inability. This is a manifest distrust of God, a denial of His word. When we murmur because of our burdens or refuse the responsibilities He calls upon us to bear, we are virtually saying that He is a hard master and that He requires what He has not given us the power to do. So this is a parable of the talents. And so if we say, well, I can't share my testimony, or I'm not eloquent enough, or whatever, it's actually kind of a lack of faith. It's saying, God's asked me to do something He's not going to equip me to do. And I've found, I guess to share a testimony of mine, I've found that it's at those times when I step out in faith beyond what I'm able to do, that's when I see God really work. And one of the times that was really memorable to me, I was a teenager, probably about 14, maybe 15. It was a Friday night, and I was on an internet chat room, an Adventist internet chat room. This is back before I realized how dangerous it was for teens to be doing that, but anyway. And we were, generally, the idea was we were supposed to be talking about the Sabbath School lesson, although we were talking about everything. And this guy comes in, and he was really discouraged. He faced some spiritual abuse in the church, and he was really about ready to give up. And the people in the chat room, they just started after him, when you type in capital letters, that's yelling online. So they were yelling at him that he just needed to have more faith and that he shouldn't be talking this way, and just really all over him. And for his lack of faith and so on. And he left the chat room. I would have too. But I felt really bad about that. I thought, he came here for encouragement, and he got yelled at. So I went and instant messaged him, which was this is AOL, back in the days of AOL, where you could just talk to two people. And I told him I was sorry for how he'd been treated, and we started chatting back and forth. You got to realize at the time I still had a learning disability, so I was really slow at reading, not fast at typing. I had very little life experience as far as life experience in general, and definitely as far as abuse and stuff like that. This guy had been through some horrendous stuff. And I found myself typing answers to him. I'd type something out, I'd hit send, and I'd read it, and I'd think, wow, I never thought of that before. And then I'd hit send again, and I'd, wow, that's a really good point. And so as I'm writing this, I'm learning what I'm writing. And it dawned on me partway through that God was speaking through my fingers. This wasn't stuff, I didn't know how to deal with these sort of situations. I had no training or anything like that. And by the end of it, he was ready to give God and the church another try and keep going. I haven't heard it ever since. But I could have easily sat back and said, what do I have to say? I'm a 14-year-old kid. I don't know anything about these things. You know, I guess I'll just have to leave that up to God to help that person somehow. But God had called me to do it, and He empowered me to do it, to say things that wisdom way beyond my years, probably still way beyond my years, you know. And so I believe that part of sharing your testimony, there's a courage involved with that, of being willing to say, to step out and share the testimony, and trust that Jesus will make Himself responsible for its results. Yeah.
And giving the message of the gospel is actually a sales job. There's a book years ago, it was Greatest Salesman, I think it was about Christ, you know, selling. You have to make a friend and then you sell a friend. So if you're a one-on-one with a person, you have to become a friend with them before you can sell them what you have. And then you have to inspire them enough to want what you have to give them is worth more than what they're going to pay for it. And so when we're talking to people, we have to make a friend first. And doing that, what we're talking about here is about giving your testimony, giving the message to them from a personal experience.
Yeah, Larry.
As to the lifetime of a personal testimony, in other words, how long should we share it? We kind of get the idea. It doesn't say it outright, but we kind of get the idea here. Revelation 14, this is the verses just before we get the three angels. And it talks about these 144,000. And they sang a new song. I read that as they're telling their story. Now you might say, well, why would the redeemed want to even tell their story? Who'd be interested? I think a lot of individuals, not necessarily fallen individuals, have been looking at what goes on this planet with great interest. We're a theater to the universe, right? And we have a story to tell. It's not a story that's limited just here on this planet, but throughout time we'll have a story to tell. This is where I was, and Jesus brought me to where I am now. Wow. And then filling in all those details.
And we know that sin will not arise up the second time, but we will still have free choice in heaven. I think a part of that will be, we will all have known the consequences of disobeying God. And without the natural tendency, because our corruptible minds will be made incorruptible, according to the Bible. So we won't have that natural tendency to want to do wrong, which pulls us into it. We'd have to make the choice to, like Adam and Eve did. But we could make the choice with more knowledge. And I think some of that knowledge will be, we're telling our testimony about what God has done in our life, and it keeps it fresh. You know, same thing with, I think Sabbath observance is a strong, it's a strong reminder of what God does in our life. It's a regular occurrence if we really observe Sabbath and not just make it a church thing, right? If we really observe it, it reminds us of our Creator. It kind of keeps us balanced. In the same way, sharing our testimony keeps us supported and balanced.
I know we're out of time and you need to wrap this up, and this is something we could spend 30 minutes on, but if indeed we have a story to tell and we'll be telling it throughout eternity, what about the memories? Someone comes up to you, what's your story? I can't remember. Is it really that? I mean, we read certain passages in the Bible and it talks about how, everything's been thrown in the depths of the sea and this and that, and I question that because that was part of my story. I'm not going to relish in it and all, but I don't think God's going to, if you remember the toy in the 1960s, the Etch-a-Sketch, I don't think God's going to take the Etch-a-Sketch and just shake it and we're just left clueless as to what we've been through. We've got a story, and if we can't recall any of it, or a lot of it has been snipped out. A bunch of fragmented thoughts. Now, yes, if we have trust in God and realize those in the hereafter, those that have been watching all of this cosmic conflict from afar, we're the theater of the universe. If they're trustworthy people, and if God is trustworthy, I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to worry about anyone shaming me or rubbing my nose in the dirt or anything like that. I mean, Jesus demonstrated that. He was very careful with Simon. He didn't, expose, even those who caught the woman in adultery in John chapter 8, he didn't tell what he could have told. He was very discreet. And if we can learn to trust God and realize that all of our past, it doesn't much matter if anyone sees. They're all good. All the people in the hereafter are going to be like Jesus. Wow. I don't have anything to fret. And I do have a story to tell.
And that brings to, I think, an important attitude regarding her story. When I asked my mom permission to share her story in church, I've shared it with lots of people, but it's the first time publicly in church, online, to the world, shared her story. And she said, well, of course, it's not my story anyway, it's God's story. And I think the reason why it won't be shameful in heaven to tell our story is because we'll recognize it's not our story, it's God's story. And there will be, humanly speaking, we still struggle with sin and selfishness, so we still, in this earth, we still struggle a little bit with that, with it being our story, but once we're in heaven, it's going to be 100% God's story, that's it. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the hymn that we sing, Holy, Holy is what the angels sing. But when we tell a redemption story, the angels are going to fold their wings because they don't have a story of salvation to tell.
Yeah. So one of the blessings of being part of the human race is that we have more special attention from God than any other being in the universe. So, well, there's so much more to get to, but we are done with our time. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us a story. Because we will be faithful in sharing that story, recognizing it, sharing it with people, and leaving you with the consequences. In Jesus' name, amen.